my experience was that there was an unquestioned wisdom when it came to the alliance, that it was healthy, and that was based on two key assumptions. One, the belief that the alliance could simply continue the way it was, that it had enough inertia and enough health to it. And second, that configuration of the alliance would continue to serve both U.S. and Japanese interests in the future. I was concerned, as were others, that those assumptions were false and created for us what we called a policy blind spot. We just wouldn't see something coming. So in the initial project, we asked three related questions. Is the alliance meeting the mutual expectations of the partners? If not, what are the potential consequences? And given the stakes, what are the policy implications for the alliance? Put another way, what was concerning us was that the two allies would enter into any future crisis with a certain set of expectations about what the other would do that were unproven, and what if those expectations were not met. Cutting to the gist here, the main argument of the papers is that the alliance is failing in significant ways to meet basic expectations of both the United States and Japan. For the U.S., the continuing inability of the alliance to operationalize itself in the core mission of the defense of Japan, as well as to be operationally relevant in the region or beyond, remain the key failings. But for Japan's purposes, while Tokyo seems to increasingly be concerned with the basic defense of Japan, it also appears there's a growing concern of the U.S. meeting and sustaining its commitments, including those to extended deterrence. And in the background of all that are questions of how each will approach an uncertain Chinese future, questions that undermine each other's confidence in the alliance. Our discussions and research suggested that at base, both partners have very reasonable reasons to feel that their core expectations are not being met, nor will they be met on the current trajectory of the alliance. And it establishes, as we saw it, a situation wherein, despite all the public statements about strength, the alliance is actually quite brittle. Only the rhetorical facade of the alliance is solid. And this comes precisely at a point in time where both allies are perhaps depending more on the alliance, certainly more than they have in the last 2 decades. So while the alliance may muddle through a crisis or a contingency, the exposure of the alliance's inability to meet key expectations in the crisis is likely to engender what we saw as a subsequent and significant, perhaps deal-breaking crisis of confidence. We also assess that the efforts to address the operational deficiencies of the alliance by having Japan do more in the regional and global arena were really just another way of papering over the problem. And in the end, were likely counterproductive. I came down on the side that the refueling mission is a clear example of an unproductive mission for the alliance. The amount of political capital that was spent on keeping that ship in the Indian Ocean could have been better spent on fixing some of the key shortcomings in the relationship. I see several policy implications stemming from this assessment. The efforts of the alliance leaders to sustain the alliance as is putting both nations at risk. The allies must develop a more sustainable set of expectations that will form a basis for the future alliance. Current efforts of policymakers to strengthen, deepen, or broaden, the key words that we all seem to use, the alliance fall short and in some meaningful ways are distracting the allies from meeting the core expectations of the alliance, which is the defense of Japan. And the alliance leaders, finally, the alliance leaders must recognize that the allies do have several options or alternatives to the current alliance relationship. And although each option carries significant downsides, these must be considered in policy calculations. In other words, we must be able to imagine something different than what we have today. So we explored the potential options, and the options are listed in the papers. They run the gamut from maintaining the status quo to fairly radical change. And while the radical change options are not the preferred options, we have to keep them on the table and acknowledge that they're there. looking at the various options, it suggests three basic paths for how the alliance could evolve from here. Should the allies choose to do nothing, the alliance can continue as is. It's not in a crisis. It is not going to fall apart tomorrow. But it will be tested at some point. And at that point, it will likely fail to live up to the mutual expectations and needs of the allies. And such a failure would, of course, have an immense repercussion across the region and go beyond the bilateral U.S.-Japan relationship. But even short of a crisis, there's a growing recognition of a hollowness of the alliance, and that will likely begin to affect how the two partners approach other bilateral issues. On the other hand, they could recognize a situation where the lack of operational capability is placing a severe limit on the strategic value of the alliance, and the allies could choose to fundamentally change the alliance to an operationally capable global security partnership. It's essentially what they've been trying to do. However, to date, frankly, the Japanese government has not been able to rally political support within Japan for a more robust operational footing for Japan, even within the context of the alliance. And while arguments have been made of Japan becoming a normal country, the fact remains that Japan is not normal, in that it places abnormal domestic political limits on its ability to act in its own national security interests. So until Japan is able to address this fundamental issue of national political will, its ability to facilitate and participate in a stronger, more operationally relevant alliance is limited, and in turn limits the value of the alliance greatly. That fact makes this course of action fundamentally flawed. On the other hand, and this gets to recalibrating the alliance, recognizing those near-term limits on Japan's ability to grow its role in meaningful ways for the alliance, the allies could and arguably should look to rescope or recalibrate the alliance in such a way that the value is increased. The alliance as a global tool, while an understandable goal, has been a bridge too far from both a political sense and from an operational one. One approach would be to forego the out-of-area mission for the alliance and return to the basic rationale for the alliance, the defense of Japan, and as a means to build the alliance's operational capability and in turn increase its value. In such a scenario, the allies would strike a new grand bargain and focus on a recalibrated or tempered arrangement that would recognize a division of labor within the alliance, wherein Japan would assume primacy in the defense of the nation and focus all of its defense efforts and resources on this principal mission. Japan would be its own first line of defense for the first time in the post-war period. The United States would renew, clarify, and strengthen its commitments to provide robust, capability-specific support to fill critical gaps, as well as provide a more general backstopping support for Japan's defense. Some have argued that that approach is somehow a step backwards. The argument's wrong on two accounts. First, the relationship I just described has never existed in this alliance, so it's not a step backward. Second, and more importantly, the argument for a recalibrated alliance focused on the defense of Japan is a recognition that, on the one hand, we must get the basics right before moving on to more complex operations, and on the other, that the domestic political will simply does not yet exist in Japan for a larger security role in the world. It may never exist, at least in our lifetimes. But a return to the basics of the defense of Japan, a defense proposition that continues to grow in complexity as the region evolves, would likely be within the political realm of possibility. Such a focus would better prepare the alliance to, at the appropriate time, stretch its limits both operationally and geographically. To use a golf metaphor for you golfers out there, if you want to improve your golf score, you work on your short game. You get that right, and the rest falls into place. In the case of the alliance, by focusing on the defense of Japan and getting the operational short game right, getting the structures and the procedures in place for the alliance to truly operate in the defense of Japan, the alliance will be better positioned to be a valuable tool for national security challenges beyond Japan. So I think a fundamental question facing alliance managers on both sides of the Pacific is whether we are able to recognize that the alliance as constituted today is not meeting our needs, and whether we are willing to fundamentally rethink our approach. If the two governments cannot recognize the underlying facts, that the alliance is of limited strategic relevance and value because of the limits placed on it by Japan's decisions, or if in recognizing this choose to continue to paper over the issue, then the alliance is on track to muddle along until it is challenged and likely fails the test of a crisis. However, if the two governments are willing to recognize the alliance both for what it is and what it is not, and take the necessary steps backwards to reset and recalibrate the alliance in order to, in the short term, provide a more robust operational capability to meet contingencies, and in the longer term, establish a more firm foundation for the security partnership, then the alliance can be set on a course that will, in the end, result in a national security tool of immense and enduring value. Thank you.